This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Hello, and welcome to this series of special episodes of AI Group's DBrief podcast. DBrief is designed to give you insights into the impact of policy on your business. In these mini episodes, we'll be talking about the kinds of policies we want to see for members in the upcoming federal election. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy, and today I'm joined by David Martin, AI Group's Director of Emerging Industries and Innovation. Now, for the other conversations around policy papers, I've invited the guest to speak about their paper, but in this case, both David and I jointly wrote this paper. So welcome, David, both as a guest and as a host.
Thank you very much, Louise. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, as I said, DBrief is a podcast designed to talk about the uncertainty that policymakers and businesses have when dealing with the 3Ds: digitalisation, decarbonisation and diversification. Never before has this been such a critical election for such a focus on these Ds as we try to transform our businesses, our industries, and in fact, the whole economy. David, what are you seeing when you're talking to members?
Thanks, Louise. I think after decades of talking about the transformation that we see appearing on the horizon with regards to digital and decarbonisation and the need to move away from old business models, it's arrived. And it's arrived during a period of significant geographical changes globally. Our partners that we thought we had close relationships with are not so close anymore. And during this great period of uncertainty, our members are in the process of trying to navigate and come up with a clear strategy for their businesses moving forward about who they're going to be in the next couple of years, how to continue engaging in global supply chains, and have a business that's going to be sustainable, profitable, and innovative into the future.
And in our industry and technology paper, we have some key recommendations for that transitional support for industrial transformation and how we can somehow address or meet the needs that come from these recession-like conditions in Australia. So, David, do you want to take us through what our key recommendations are there?
Absolutely. The first and key one is that there is a need for some transitional support with regards to members and industry at large for industrial transformation. In the past, the Australian government of both stripes has come up with a number of significant programs with regards to assisting the leaders of businesses to undertake the transformations necessary. Quite often, people who are working in these businesses are so caught in the daily operational aspects and not actually thinking strategically about positioning themselves that the capacity to work with an advisor of some kind to guide them and come up with the key recommendations and that will address the challenges moving forward is often missing. Certainly, while there are consultants that are out there, there have been a number of successful programs in the past. Enterprise Connect, the Entrepreneurs Program, both provided access to advisors who were at least general managers or ex-CEOs of organisations and understand the inherent loneliness and challenges that business owners face on a daily basis when you are the boss and everything sits with you about moving things forward. And we'd like to see a similar kind of program assistance, regardless who comes into government in the future, again, being made available to these kinds of businesses. I think another key thing is that both sides of politics have actually mentioned in their policies for the upcoming election that they are looking at some quite large programs with regards to transforming transforming Australian industry. But quite often there's very little at the back end to assist the smaller businesses to get a piece of that pie and fit into these larger ways of looking at things. So we absolutely think some sort of transformational journey with regards to these kinds of programs would be a benefit to our members and industry at large.
And you mentioned at the outset, the geopolitical tensions and uncertainty, and certainly there's a lot of protectionism that's been a trend for some time across the globe. And not just protectionism, but really heavy investment into local industries. The US had the Inflation Reduction Act. Europe has met with similar programs. Australia's a smaller economy. We have many demands on our small budget and we don't have the deep pockets. So we think, obviously we need to be a bit smarter when it comes to running these programs, investing in these programs, really, not wasting our money. And in my experience, whatever problem you're trying to solve with government subsidies or government support, they all have to end. All those programs have to end. And sometimes the end, once business models have shaped around them, like a virus, that once they end, it's actually more problematic and more traumatic than whatever the problem is you're starting to solve. But anyway, so we've got some principles that we've put forward. Do you want to take us through those, David?
Absolutely. So we have some strategic priorities for any new industry programs that are developed by the government of the day in the future. And these are our strategic principles that the industry policy and industry programs need to follow. Firstly, it needs to have a distinctive role in the marketplace. It needs to be clear and specific and identifies the market failure and what it's hoping to address. Secondly, it needs to take an ecosystem approach to industrial transformation. Too many of the actual programs that we see launched don't actually take into account they're part of an industrial ecosystem, and sometimes there are unexpected consequences of what's been actually implemented, and sometimes it's actually also duplicating existing programs that might be being provided at the state or federal level. We think there needs to be a sovereign adaptability aspect to any industrial transformation that is being attempted by these trying to address market failures, and it must also be realistically shaped to respond to the issue. Not all problems need money. Regulatory reform might be the correct solution. Untying the hands of business and letting them get on with why they're in business in the first place can be actually more impactful than actually a program. In fact, there's a quite common quote amongst the startup community that quite often people would find a contract with government more powerful than a grant, because it gives you credibility and learning, so to speak. We think it has to have a stepping stone towards an internationally competitive capability that is uniquely Australian, and we certainly do have those. And most of all, it needs to be simple to administer and to access. I'm currently in the process of doing some consultations for a thing that we're going to be putting in shortly. And one of the key things is government granting programs. Quite often people don't actually apply for because the administrative burden requires hiring a person to actually do the reporting for it. And at the end of the day, the financial benefit is actually not going to help the company at all. So simplicity is key.
Great.
Louise, as the lead and head of industry development and policy at AI Group, you also have a deep understanding of some of the key areas that industry is grappling with and looking to for a productivity gain, such as digital capability. So in view of the productivity challenges we are seeing in Australia at the moment, how can the uplift in digital capability, particularly around cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, enhance Australia's technology landscape and ensure the safe adoption of these new technologies and make certain that business gets the most out of these from a productivity perspective?
Well, David, we've called for an uplift of digital capability and programs to assist that. I think as per the recommendations for our industry support, some of that might be money, some of that might be education, but it also might be sensible regulations that give people some guardrails to give them some confidence to invest in this sort of technology, but doesn't increase the barriers or introduce new barriers or make it too uncertain. So we are really concerned around the proposed guardrails for artificial intelligence, for example. So for a lot of Australian companies, it won't be as simple as to say, well, I'm a builder of AI technology or I'm a consumer of AI technology. And a lot of the regulation, we look around the world, they have that binary approach. The reality is companies will be buying in AI technology, but they'll also be adapting it to their needs, changing it just by, the minute you turn it on, it will change because you'll be giving it new data to learn from. And so where does the responsibilities lie? And I think that's one of the challenges for Australian companies as they look at this technology is, where is our risk? We're a very risk-averse country. All reward and punishment is based around managing risk well. And we need to make sure that we're not so risk-averse that we are preventing companies from investing. And the reason why we want companies to invest in AI is so that they can, as you say, lift their productivity, but more importantly, compete with the world. We're a very small market. It's really difficult for us to get scale, and we really need AI to provide the speed and the scaling that is required to be internationally competitive. The other issue with digital capability is we need as a country to address the digital divide. And this is not just a business issue, this is a wider societal issue. But there are children going to school without laptops, without access to the internet. They are the workers we need in the future. So how do we make sure that as many people as possible have access to digital technologies? Because very soon it is the only way they'll be able to engage meaningfully with the economy.
Absolutely.
But David, you've mentioned that you're talking to members around how we can lift productivity through R&D, through investing in new technologies. So what are you hearing about this idea of a technology de-risking centre?
Thanks. This is an initiative that has come out of our key discussions with our members on a couple of different things. It goes without saying that in speaking with our members, many of them understand the critical importance of digitally transforming their businesses. They understand the need to decarbonise their businesses, but the place to actually start that actual discussion and start that actual progression for many is at the board and at the executive level. And many of them are challenged and concerned that with the investments involved, that they will make a mistake and it will be bad for the business, so they don't know where to go. Having discussions with organisations such as the Irish Manufacturing Research and other centres around the world, they're actually in Europe and in the United States and in some other major nations, specific centres where small to medium enterprises can actually engage and get a hands-on experience in a sandbox environment of things like robotics and automation and CNC machines. And they get to play, see and talk to real engineers about what actually has to happen about bringing these actual technologies back to their actual businesses and get them up and running. And this isn't just manufacturing businesses. Some of these technologies are actually just as important for professional services. We've mentioned AI as an example. So what has actually been happening around the globe and very successfully is that we're having these technology de-risking centres where people can go in and see things being used live. They'll see 4 different robots from 4 different operators. It's all technology agnostic. And they get the opportunity with their engineering teams to see what capacity and capabilities they need before they start going away and making these key capital purchases on their organisation and feel assured that it's going to be right for their business. The other thing that these actual centres also provide is skills and training that sits around these technology purchases and also discussions about how it fits into the overarching business model. One of the things we've talked about with regards to new industry programs is that it should never be done in isolation because it may have an unexpected consequence. And the key thing of these technology centres is it does allow you to think, well, okay, if I do get this up and running in the back office where we're going to be making the things, how will this actually impact on the front office, our CRMs, our ERP systems, all these other things? So it's a holistic way of actually assisting our members and industry at large to understand how they can take these next critical steps forward. And I think the tagline that you and I both like to use, Louise, is there's no decarbonisation without digitalisation, and there's no digitalisation without transforming one's business models. So not only will you get an understanding about how to digitally transform your business, but do it in a manner that will reduce energy costs, which is a key issue of concern to our members, but also in a way that means that your impact on the environment will be less. So one of the things, Louise, that we discussed at the start of this is that we are currently going through one of the more disruptive times when it comes to international relationships. And there's a level of geopolitical uncertainty at the moment. So for those of our members that are in the process of currently exporting in the current environment, how can we boost international connectedness and reform ageing border systems in order to improve our trade facilitation process and create more robust supply chains? Having just gone through Cyclone Alfred, I've just seen the whole thing with the toilet paper disappears at the supermarket again and all the rest of that, which brought back COVID and, the access to global supply chains. But I'm interested in your thoughts about this and what the recommendations in the paper are.
So supply chains are a perennial issue now. I mean, I think before COVID, no one gave really one thought about supply chains. But as you say, the minute there's any disruption, the trauma comes back very, very quickly. The thing with, we can talk briefly around the impending trade war. The first trade war, which was just before COVID, and I found really more disruptive and in some regards more upsetting than, or more onerous than COVID. But it really affected every business individually because there is no single supply chain that everyone has. People seem to consider, and governments seem to consider supply chains as literally a chain, just one, chains links in a chain fence. You'd probably describe it more as a pearl necklace. And, so it's circular. If you've got a very nice necklace with individually knotted pearls and it breaks, the pearls won't crash to the floor. If you do not, if you know cheap pearl necklaces or bead necklaces, those beads will go crashing everywhere. And so is companies' supply chain. So really now companies with inflation costs and the other cost pressures have dropped back on some of their investment in supply chains. So they're not necessarily as robust as they were just at the end of COVID when everyone was still under that pressure. There has been now for a few successive governments a department under Department of Industry called the Office of Supply Chain Resilience. They're a great team to work with to explore these issues. It's very micro work, but sitting down with groups of companies doing scenario planning, what happens if there's another, earthquake in Japan, or if there's floods in Thailand, or, war breaks out in Ukraine again, all those sorts of things that disrupted our supply chains. How ready are companies? Their first answer is always, well, I'll just give my supplier a call because I have people they've known for 20 years. We have to explain phones don't always work in these scenarios. But sitting down, and it's takes a lot of investment. It's probably actually quite a small investment in terms of the potential impact for the economy, but we really do think that this sort of capability within government to build that capability across industry is absolutely crucial. But in terms of our ageing borders, there has been a significant amount of investment into something called simplifying our trade system. The challenge with simplifying our trade system is that there's 5 or 6 ministers potentially involved at the border. There's Home Affairs, there's Agriculture, there's DFAT, there's Finance, there's a whole range. And no one ever seems to want to give ground. And everyone thinks that their particular form is absolutely critical and it cannot be changed. And, nothing must be changed in that form because it's all critical information and they must continue as is. So that has been challenging, but we haven't given up. Australia now has over 80% of our trade covered by a free trade agreement, which means that a lot of goods coming into the country are coming in duty-free, which improves competitiveness of Australian companies, makes it cheaper for consumers. It's important to remember that most of our exports actually rely on imports. So we need to have a good border for goods going backwards and forwards. There is data to show that if you improve the trade systems and trade facilitation, it has 10 times the economic benefit of reducing tariffs. And reducing tariffs is already shown to have a great benefit for Australian consumers and Australian business. So we do think there needs to be more trade facilitation. We have a very, very old IT system. The problem is that the heavy exporters don't want to change it because they've invested heavily into their IT systems to match it. Small exporters who only export 1 to 3 times a year, which is about half of our exporters, probably less worried. But the challenge is if we don't invest in this system, eventually it will die and then it will be a nightmare. But all government IT projects seem to be fraught. So we just want everyone to be strong and brave and try to make this investment and try to make this change.
You mentioned tariffs before, and I think it might be really powerful for you to mention our position on this because it's something we've put out in recent media releases and our position regardless who wins government in the next couple of months, our thoughts on this particular thing.
Yeah, so especially in regard to the US tariffs. So we are very much free traders, as is, the bulk of the country. As I said, exports rely on imports. There's just no two ways about it. The US steel and aluminium exports, there's a lot of narrative that it's only, 1% of the Australian economy, and that is true, especially if you just focus on the steel and aluminium exports as a product. But what people aren't looking at is the second page or the second announcement, which is the derivatives. So if you're exporting, a child's trampoline, if you're exporting automotive parts, I spoke to a member who's exporting furnaces. Someone else is exporting hand tools. All these have a certain percentage of steel and aluminium. And the new rules mean that they will have very convoluted declarations they have to complete about what percentage of that final product is made up of steel or aluminium. Where does it come from? How much duty did you pay on it? Did you pay dumping duties, etc.? And while from a nation point of view, true, very small percentage. But my fear is that at an enterprise level, so for the company, this could be significant. When the automotive industry, in terms of the car makers, closed down in Australia, that doesn't mean a lot of our automotive suppliers closed down. A lot of them actually really globally competitive because they're selling to the car companies who are really tough on them. But, if you think about Australian manufacturing, I know some of you have already heard me say this before, if we think about it in three broad categories, low skilled, low technology, a lot of that has moved offshore. So fasteners, nuts and bolts, cheap T-shirts, etc. Mid-tech or mid-technology and mid-skilled products such as car assembly also has moved offshore because we're a very small market, so we don't have the scale. But the things that you really care about in the car, like your brake pads, like the steel springs that go into gearboxes, those things are still made in Australia where quality counts. Now, which means that a lot of Australian companies have had very good exports to the US because the margin, especially into the NASCAR sector. And I do fear a lot of these are metals based, that they're going to be really disrupted in this. And we'll keep monitoring it. We've got meetings next week with the embassy. We keep advocating. But I think this is the thin edge of the wedge. I think it will certainly cover a number of other exports, particularly agriculture. So I think the government's made the right choice not to do reciprocal tariffs. It doesn't serve our economy well. We withstood the economic coercion from China, and I'm sure we will stand it from the US as well.
Thanks. I think one of the other elements about cross-borders too relates to our need for skilled migration in Australia. It goes without saying, regardless if you're in far north Queensland or in Dandenong in Victoria, getting access to skilled technicians, tradespeople, engineers, etc., is incredibly challenging, and it's one of the issues about productivity and growth opportunities in businesses, which is harming them. So when we think about a robust and responsive skilled migration program to support industry and address these apparent shortages in trades, technicians, etc., what is our position on this in our recommendations in the paper?
So, of course, we want Australia to also invest in our own people to improve our own skills and to make sure we have the right skills within Australia to meet industry needs. And I'll have another conversation with our Director for Centre of Education and Training, Caroline Smith, to talk about that. But, while we invest in that, that's a long-term game. Today, we need people because whether it's under AUKUS or it's under decarbonisation or it's, cybersecurity skills, there's a number of really critical categories where we have these significant skill gaps. And so we want to make sure that companies who are doing the right thing, who want to bring in these high-skilled migrants, can do so with confidence and without too much expense. We are competing on a global market for these people. So it's whether it's Canada, the US, may or may not be, but certainly I think US is still very popular. Certainly in Europe, there's a lot of markets trying to attract these people. If we make it too bureaucratic, we make the regulatory load too heavy, then we will miss out on this critical talent. And if anyone wants to have a look at our economics resource, what's it called? Resource Centre, Economics Resource Centre, we have a very useful paper on the impact that skilled migration has made to Australia. And these are people, when they get to Australia, very unlikely to be unemployed, very often to take further studies to improve their skills, really invest, as culturally, really invest in their skills, really invest in making sure that they've got current and marketable skills, which means that Australian employers really benefit from attracting these people.
Absolutely.
And when we think about, so we've called our paper, I think, Industry and Science and Technology. So there's another I missing, which is innovation. But when we're thinking about our strategy for innovation, science and technology, what is our proposed solution?
So there's a number of different elements with regards to our proposed solution, and we certainly in the next couple of weeks will be putting in a full paper for the strategic review of R&D as well, where we have heavily engaged with our members and we actually have some really novel solutions we'd like to share at large around this area. But one of the key challenges in Australia is that we have, compared to overseas countries, a quite short election period. We tend to do it in 3 years, sometimes 4 if you're at the state level. And what research and development and innovation really requires is a measure of certainty, because a lot of the technologies we're trying to develop, and Australia certainly has global expertise in things like quantum and a whole range of other novel areas, is to provide industry and the research sector a measure of stability and certainty over a longer period of time when it comes to these things. Programs that just get up and running, and I think we've seen with such things as the National Reconstruction Fund and some of the other programs, even though we are being apolitical and proudly so, it takes time to spin these programs up, regardless who happens to be in government at the time. And quite often it's only at the back end, the last year, that you actually start seeing engagement and money going out the door. So what we're proposing is the development of a new ministerial council, and there are a number. There's Ministerial Council for Energy, Transport, data, and a range of other different areas. And these are primarily set up because there's an acknowledgement there has to be the state governments and the federal governments in the same room, because these are cross-border issues, and we need to be able to provide industry and all sectors some measure of certainty about how laws, regulation, policy will run into the future. Some of these areas, like infrastructure, involve serious capital investment that will, sometimes take decades to spin out. So what we would like to see for the innovation sector in Australia is a Ministerial Council for Innovation, Science and Technology. And we would like that so that we see, an avoiding of the duplication of different programs between states and federal governments, so the money is not wasted. We would like to have a measure of certainty around key critical areas of technology and fields of research that should be in place. We would like to see that any funding or support for industry, whether it's tax incentives, grants or otherwise, or it might be discussions with experts in the area, again, are in place for a sufficiently long period of time because R&D by its nature takes long and it is actually risky, that we'll actually reap the benefits and commercialise the outcomes, regardless if it sits in the research sector or the business sector, and we can actually see novel technologies and jobs built here in Australia, rather than going overseas or collapsing under their own weight because they haven't just made it through the valley of death in time.
I do think that if we thought about our R&D and IP in the same way we think about our sports stars, I mean, fancy if someone started playing for another country. There was a coach in the last Olympics, was it, who dared to praise someone in Korea for their swimming skills, and there was an outcry. If we had the same attitude to our IP, we think about Gardasil, which was invented in Australia and is now, if you go to America, marketed in every second ad, it seems, on TV.
Wow.
So, crazy that we just let it all walk out the door. But David, thinking about our IP and what we do with it, we've made a recommendation around creating a national IP bank for commercialising intellectual property created by public sector research organisations. That sounds, quite a big, bold idea. Just talk us through it.
Absolutely. So Australia's public sector research organisations are truly world-class with regards to the creation of novel intellectual property. I think that we are, when it comes to the global number of patents and other types of papers, we're sitting at 4%. So we really, I hear the statement, we punch way above our weight with the development of novel research. Unfortunately, when you look at the D and the C, which is the development and commercialisation of this public sector research, we are definitely not in the top, or in fact, we're right down the bottom of the OECD rankings. What I find is a little unfair is that we tend to laud our universities for being, and our public sector research organisations such as CSIRO for being so amazingly at creating research, and then tend to hit them over the head with a large club because they don't commercialise it. It's somewhat, if we're going to use the Olympics as an able metaphor, it's somewhat like looking at the gymnastics team and saying how amazing they are on the floor and then complaining that they can't play basketball really well. So these people are researchers because they love doing research and they do it superbly well, and that's why we do punch above our weight. So the novel idea that we've come up with, and it's actually in Singapore and other countries around the world, is the development of a centralised IP bank. At its most simplest, what that is that any public sector research that has been funded by the government and doesn't already have a relationship with industry to take to market will sit in a centralised location with a standard set of contracts around royalties with regards to the actual format of those contracts. You're not dealing with 42 different contracts and 42 different sets of lawyers, so to speak. And we would actually have commercialisation specialists whose whole role is to make sure that intellectual property is put in the hands of those people who can take it to market in the most rapid means of doing so and maximise royalties for not only the bank, but also the university and the government, who's used taxpayers' funding to actually pay for a lot of this research in at the start of this. So what this means is that everyone wins. The university sector has been very clear in the last 12 to 18 months about it is under pressure with regards to finance and funds. The international students and other things are causing issues. So rather than allowing them to be concerned about funding, commercialising, developing, let's actually support them about what they do best, which is research. Take this off their hands and give them a clear level of cash flow into their organisation so they can keep on doing what they do best. And the Australian public, whose taxes have paid for a lot of this, gets to benefit at large. So that's our suggestion. Always the details are going to be where it's going to be a bit complicated, but it has been done, and it has been done successfully before overseas. And I think this would allow us to really maximise the commercialisation of all the research that we currently have in our amazing institutions.
Well, David, I think I'm not sure if we've acted like two sock puppets, two hands talking to each other, being host and guest. We've certainly gone longer for this, what's called a mini episode. But anyway, I think it's been a useful conversation and covered all the issues that we've put on our industry paper. And after the election, we'll have another go and see if we can track how those policies are going with the new government.
And if our members are interested in saying something on the papers when they come out, how's the best way of reaching us, Louise?
So there'll be a contact on the webpage where they find these podcasts, but as always, industry.policy@aigroup.com.au. Thanks very much, David.